I don't think people know that Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle, for that matter, were banned from baseball back in the 70s into the 80s because they were associated with, and I thought it was Las Vegas casinos. They were actually Atlantic City casinos.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and I don't think people know that. In fact, it took Bowie Kuhn was the one, the commissioner at the time, who basically is trying to somehow protect the game, and they were goodwill ambassadors for casinos. They weren't betting or anything like that.
No, they just worked at the casino.
Right, and it was shocking, really, that Willie Mays got elected to the Hall of Fame, and then 5 months later was banned from baseball. I still have a problem thinking of that. Like, why
It
is
doesn't
it
really
more
make
of
a
an
lot
outcry?
of. It doesn't really. I think because at the time, well, there's a lot of things at the time you would have to go into there, which I think I'm surprised. Was there more of an outcry for Mantle at the time being banned than Mays? Because it would be pretty telling as to why.
I don't know that. I don't know that. I can't speak to that.
I'm just saying. It's hard for me not to think that would be part of it.
Yeah, I think that to that point, if there's a racist undertone to all of this, I think the boxer Joe Louis also became a greeter at casinos late in his career, and was unfairly sort of taken to task for that, as it was sad. And I don't know that they felt that way about Mickey Mantle. So
right,
and the ability to earn money for players after their careers, even when Willie retired in the 70s, was really tough. Willie was getting $50,000 a year from the Mets, but he wanted to make other money, and it wasn't like he had a job that would be. He'd never make the money that some of the other guys did. These guys needed to work in order to keep feeding themselves and their families.
Right, it wasn't like today. I mean, Willie Mays, when he retired, had stats that basically nobody else. He was, one of those guys in baseball. That's if you make a Mount Rushmore of baseball, he's on the Mount Rushmore. That's how good he was. So for a guy like him, 5 months or so after he's retired, he didn't go take a second job just to make money. I mean, that's even no-name baseball players don't really have to do that as much because they absolutely have to, kind of deal.
Well, and today they get paid so much, you
Right.
can be a marginal player. You'll have more money than Willie Mays ever did as a player.
Exactly. So it was just a totally different thing. It's just wild to think that one of the superstars in the game at the time had to deal with something like that.
I could argue that Willie Mays might be the greatest player ever.
You could, he certainly, and it's interesting because, one of the things that Willie Mays was called until he passed away just last week was the greatest living ball player. A title I believe he took over from first DiMaggio, who had taken it over from Ty Cobb, I believe.
I think so. I'm not sure about the Ty Cobb thing, but I do think that Joe DiMaggio definitely was the one that held it for a long time. I wanted to talk about, gambling for a second because, I didn't realize this, and this is something I pulled out of an interesting little article. So gambling and baseball have gone together since the mid-19th century when owners realized they could turn a profit on games, which is interesting that it goes, back that far. It was actually more common in small towns where there was no access to casinos or anything like that, and rural people identified with the sport because it was a game of competition and skill and chance, and basically the games went on every day. So gambling was a big part of. I didn't realize that was a big part of baseball. And I think that they were leaning into it. Almost all the teams featured gambling to various degrees on both sides. How many hits? How many? We're talking about
the game, like
right in the mid 1800s into the 1900s. So I mean, this has been going on for such a long time because they couldn't make money. So actually, gambling was a way to supplement income.
Right, exactly, because there wasn't enough money in the sport itself. And honestly, interestingly enough, that's a problem that. Just to give an example, that's a problem that plagues esports right now to a huge degree because there isn't enough money in the sport to entirely sustain itself. There's a lot of parasitic gambling elements that can move in and cause a lot of problems because the players can go like, well, wait a second, I can throw this one match and make more money in a day than I'm making all season. And that's how you end up with a situation like the 1919 Black Sox.
The 19th century ball players at times were not paid a regular salary. They earned their money through betting. I mean, this is unbelievable. Gambling was such a big feature that modern-day baseball fans would have a difficult time recognizing the sport as it was then compared to today.
And I think if we really wanted to talk about the hypocrisy of gambling in baseball and just how ludicrous it is with professional sports right now you can bet on which league will have the first major gambling scandal.
That's good.
I mean, think about that. NFL's leading, by the way. It's the NFL, the NFL, MLB, NBA, NHL. But a lot of people are saying that's not necessarily the case because you also have to think about how easy it is to have a is to cheat, essentially. Because gambling, if you're doing that and throwing the game or something, you need a game where a singular player can much more easily throw a game. It's pretty hard for one guy to throw a baseball game, except the pitcher, and it's kind of obvious, like, if he's not doing a good, like, if Garrett Cole all of a sudden went out in a World Series game and just looked bad in a way that wasn't just like, oh, he was missing his spots, he's throwing 5 miles an hour less, people might be a little weirded out by that. But, like, your right fielder can't miss fly balls that aren't hit to him.
And we all put a point at the 1919 World Series that you've already mentioned. And another scandal that came about betting happened after the 1919 World Series, but it was related to that. So the American League president, Van Johnson, allowed Ty Cobb and Hall of Famer Tris Speaker, they were teammates at the very late in their career, to resign at the end of 1926 in what became known as the Dutch Leonard Affair. I read a whole book on this. It was really, really interesting. And basically that they had a feud with Dutch Leonard, and it became known that there was a bet on the game that they all knew were fixed in the 1919 World Series. And then so Dutch Leonard was paid $20,000 to keep the evidence concealed. And when the cover-up was revealed, Van Johnson was forced out as American League president. And by the way, that's eventually how we ended up with Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, because Van Johnson was president of American League, not all of baseball. He decided we need an overseer for both leagues. And that's how you ended up with the commissioner itself. So, and obviously Pete Rose being the poster child for betting on baseball, because he did it, the thing about betting on games when he was managing. We don't know about what happened when he was playing. And we don't know that he necessarily bet against the Reds, but there's sketchy evidence on both sides.
And it's just getting more and more concerning, because recently, to start off the year, we had the fear that Shohei Ohtani was implicated in a gambling scandal. And I guess, thankfully, it was just his interpreter stealing millions of dollars for him.
Oh, definitely, thankfully.
To fund his own gambling addiction, which is,
Right. That's sad in and of itself.
And then we had 4 different major league players be kicked out of baseball for gambling. And now we have an umpire, Pat Hoberg, under investigation for gambling. Now, that investigation has not finished, and Hoberg has vehemently denied being, connected to it in any way. But at the same time, the MLB feels like they got enough evidence to go after
that's a big thing for them to bring charges against
a unioned umpire, which they're not going to mess with unless they think they got something, so that'll be interesting. But we're starting to see more and more people getting knocked for gambling, which just feels very, very strange when BetMGM and FanDuel are official sponsors of Major League Baseball.
Right, and there's the hypocrisy right there.
Right.
Like baseball has totally leaned in to having gambling be a part of baseball, as you say, sponsoring teams.
Yeah, the Diamondbacks, the Red Sox, the White Sox, the Cubs, the Reds, the Guardians, the Rockies, the Tigers, the Astros, the Mets, the Yankees, and the Padres as of last year. So that's not even including any teams that might have picked them up this offseason. All of those teams were sponsored by a gambling team, by a gambling organization in some fashion.
Yeah, and so, you can't. I don't think MLB, certainly we all know they're not going to go back and put the genie back in the bottle and try to disassociate themselves from gambling. But how stringent are they going to be in terms of really policing people?
Part of me wonders if it's sort of like a thing where all the major sports leagues are like, you know what? We're going to ride this out for as long as we can and hope we're not the first one.
We're the big scandal.
Right. We're not the big scandal. It can happen. Maybe it'll be the NFL, maybe it'll be the NBA, the NHL. As long as we're not the first one, we can then back out at that point, and it won't ever be a big issue as much.
And every once in a while, we'll throw a couple of guys, into the clink.
Yeah,
and say, oh, you guys were gambling guys, and so it makes like we were being really enforcing of all this kind of stuff.
When in reality, it's not that they couldn't care less, but more I think that it's just not a priority for them, because realistically, the gambling on the game only becomes an issue if it undermines the fans' trust in the product being put on the field.
The game has to be played on the level, as
right.
I said.
So there is also the world where somehow they're able to convince the fans that it is on the level, and it just becomes an open thing. Players can now bet on the game because, well, the fans are convinced it's totally okay. That could happen too. There's a world in which we totally go the other direction, because I think, like you said, it's going to be so hard to put the genie back in the bottle. I mean, sports gambling was only legalized outside of Nevada in 2018, and look how fast it has just absolutely taken over professional sports leagues.
Right. There was a 1992 federal law that limited sports betting primarily to Nevada, and you wonder how much was MLB and the other sports lobbying the Supreme Court, if they could, to say, this is a stupid rule. Everybody's betting anyway. Let's make it legal everywhere.
And they're not wrong. People like gambling. There's nothing inherent inherently wrong with gambling. The act of gambling in and of itself isn't the problem. It is all of the things that surround it, both from a quality and integrity of the game perspective, the impact it has on both players and fans. Because if you want to look at something, look at all the players saying that they fear the annoyed gamblers far more than the disappointed fans. And so I do think it's interesting in respect to that the MLB and all the professional sports leagues are courting them so heavily when just 50 years ago they were banning Willie Mays because he worked at a casino.
And so it's so important to keep in mind that because the players are paid so much more than they used to be, you'd like to think that the temptation isn't as great for them to take, to take some money because they're already being paid and it's a huge risk. Whereas before, that might be more money than you can make playing the game.
And that's especially relevant, and it's especially relevant that the lowest paid players on the team are making enough to feel secure that way, because Shohei Ohtani doesn't have to worry about money. So for him, the only reason why he would ever agree to throw a game like that is because he's just such a degenerate gambler that he just can't help it.
It was his agent, not him.
But that's what I'm saying. That's the only way you're ever going to get a player of that quality to do something, is they just literally can't resist the money and the gambling. Which, at a guy, if you're that good at baseball, you're probably not going to be that. But it's the 25th, the 26th guys on the team, the guys that are making the league minimum. Those are the guys that if you put a big enough check in front of them are more vulnerable.
Fortunately, because they're the 25th or 26th guys, they're not playing that
much. It's a much harder. You're right. I guess
so
we really got to look out as far as disaffected relievers.
So let's say that the 26th guy gets a start in a Sunday afternoon game after a night game on Saturday, trying to give the guys a rest, and the gamblers come in and say, "Okay, here's what I want you to do," and he's we're going to pay you $300,000 to
Because the thing that people don't think about with the gambling is they always think about it in terms of winning or losing. But because of all the prop bets, all you have to do is approach that guy and go, "Hey, so there's a prop bet for you today. You go 0 for 4 with 4 Ks. Just saying." And now that guy's thinking about, it's just one game with 4 strikeouts. I barely play anyway, and I could earn more today if I just strike. And nobody's going to blink twice if I strike out 4 times.
And I think your very good point is that, it's the lower level players, and that's what's happening now. We're seeing these sort of peripheral players, that are being, because they're the ones that are most vulnerable. Tucupita Marcano was probably not going to be a big major league star, right?
But for one day, he could make money like a big major league star.
And now he's got a book he's able to write about all the gambling, I guess, at this point. That's because he's not going to play baseball anymore because he's been banned for life.
And I think probably the saddest thing is that, we're now going to probably have people gambling on who the now greatest living ball player is.
Yeah, let's talk about a more fun subject.
Right. Because I think, more fun, because, this week we had an absolutely phenomenal game at Rickwood Field. I think that if you are a baseball fan or just even really anybody, you owe it to yourself to watch Reggie Jackson's answer. It's about 3 minutes long.
Yeah.
Watch that, about his experience playing at Rickwood Field, what it meant to him. And I think having that kind of story told at Rickwood was so important, because as much as it is a celebration of what it was, we can't forget why it existed.
So he talked about the level of racism that he experienced, that he wouldn't want to go back and do that. And what was also most interesting about the telecast was that it left A-Rod and Kevin Burkhardt stunned. Like they didn't really know what to say when the guy said, "Hey, I was afraid to go places. They would throw me out. The team would have to support me."
But all of the other people on the stage, all the other African American men on stage, knew what he was
nodding his
about.
head, going
right, which tells you a lot about the different worlds people have grown up in.
Now, Reggie is not one of the players that would be necessarily thought of as the greatest living ball player. He might be one of the most famous living ball players.
Right, he might be more famous, but only in October would he ever get that nod.
Exactly. So, so Tyler Kepner in The Athletic did a nice job sort of rounding out the top 25 guys by B-War. And that's probably, I don't love starting with that as the premise.
Right, because B-War, as much as we've in this very podcast railed against counting stats, lifetime B-War is kind of a counting stat.
Exactly. So a guy like Sandy Koufax, who I would argue is the greatest living pitcher right now. I would put him ahead of Clemens and Randy Johnson. It was really hard to do that. Those guys, Maddox,
Pedro,
right, all those.
Steve Carlton.
Let's say that but because his career was so short, Koufax doesn't even rate in the top 25 in all-time B-War.
Right, so that's where B-War is not necessarily the best statistic to use.
So, the lifetime B-War leader, as we talk about all the time on this podcast, is Barry Bonds. and he would have to be considered, in my mind, one of the greatest living players, if not the greatest living player.
I think it's kind of interesting because if I'm thinking about guys that I could put into that context, you have to think first about what to me is the greatest living ball player. So I'm like, okay, probably a position player. As unfair as that is.
I feel the same.
Simply because they're able to affect the game on two fronts, both defensively and offensively, where it's much harder for a pitcher to do that. And that's why... And that's why Shohei Ohtani, if he goes back to being a pitcher, could very easily take this.
And he'd have to do it for a long
time. But
time.
if he did it for another 5-6 years, it's going to get really hard because literally nobody's ever produced at an elite level on both sides of the ball like that.
That's a great point, and
But he's far away from that. So you're kind of left with, okay, so that means a guy like Bonds can get it in my mind because there's really not been a better hitter of Bonds in the past 100 years, maybe. Close to 80, certainly.
I would, well, and then you factor in the idea that he's doing it against today's pitchers.
Right.
It makes it even,
I think another guy you could have up there would be A-Rod.
I do, too.
I think as much as people don't like him, and you can't knock him for steroids because you got Bonds right there. So either you're including them both or you're getting rid of them both.
But it doesn't feel like, and one thing about both Bonds and A-Rod, and that's A-Rod's up there because he's third in the lifetime B war on this list after Clemens.
But A-Rod was also a Gold Glove player at multiple,
as was Bonds,
multiple defensive positions.
Well, not multiple. The Bonds was just
right, but A-Rod was at multiple.
Yes, shortstop and third base.
Shortstop and third. So to me, there are very few guys that can boast doing that. I think Biggio is another one of them that won Gold Gloves at multiple positions.
Well, Biggio did, in fact, he didn't win them in three positions, but he won. He was a catcher, a second baseman, and a center fielder. So talk about a guy
versatility
in the middle of the diamond.
Right, but even Biggio would not be up. No. So I think another guy that we've talked about a lot that I think does deserve to get put onto this list because there are very few guys I think have ever impacted the game of baseball on a daily basis like him, and that's Rickey Henderson.
Yeah, I kind of distilled it down to, wow, if I'm not going to pick Barry Bonds,
Henderson,
probably pick Rickey Henderson.
You kind of have to consider because there is nobody has ever hit like he did and stole bases like he did. There are guys that stole bases like he did, but none of them were the hitter that Rickey was. Lou Brock was not the hitter that Rickey Henderson was.
No, he wasn't. He wasn't. And Mike Schmidt got a lot of support from saying like this guy dominated the game at the third base position. Was obviously a Gold Glove fielder, a real good guy, humble guy. I don't know that Rickey Henderson was thought of as positively as Mike Schmidt was, because Rickey was a bit of an iconoclast.
Rickey was about Rickey.
A lot. Right, Rickey being Rickey, you know, and of course at the end of his career, he played for the Mets, and he famously was in the locker room playing cards with his feet up at a point when they wanted him on the field. So Rickey's kind of a guy who kind of does his own thing,
right? And that's always been what made Rickey lovable and an interesting character, but maybe not always the best teammate.
But revolutionizing the game from the running standpoint, right, being the greatest base stealer of all time,
right,
bar none. There is nobody else,
and I think that's so important that revolutionizing.
More runs than anybody, too.
But revolutionizing the game, I think, is something that you really have to give a lot of people credit for. Like, that's why if you're looking at basketball, you have to rank Steph Curry in my mind so highly now because he has fundamentally changed the way the game basketball is played. You could argue Rickey did that for baseball. Nobody ever considered just like, what if you're just fast enough to steal second base every single time you get on? And the amount of defensive pressure that puts on the other team. And you're seeing it now in baseball with the increase of the size of the bases. The best teams in baseball are also teams that run a lot.
Our next episode is going to be on stolen bases, actually, after this one. But Rickey not only stole bases, by the way, he was better at stealing third than he was at stealing second. So his career percentage, I think, was higher stealing third because he could really do a job on people.
And then he also just sometimes would lead the game off with a home run.
Well, the most leadoff homers in the history of baseball, and 297 career home runs for Rickey Henderson. So you have to think about that, right? Like that's like I wish he'd gotten to 300 because it would be kind of a cool number to be able to say.
If he had 300, that would put then you could basically see nobody else has 300 home runs and 1,000 steals. Nobody has 300 home runs and like 500 steals, pretty much. There's not. That's a very. I mean, there might be somebody else that has that, but there's not a lot of guys that are going to be in that group. It is an incredibly exclusive category that probably only Henderson would belong to, and maybe the Bondses.
I wanted to mention some of the other names on the list because these are all names that sort of have the same underline, they have great B-war, obviously, but they also were good defensive players. Albert Pujols, recently retired, right, made himself, actually, because he wasn't a great defender when he came into Major League Baseball. He made himself into a Gold Glove first baseman.
And if you look at the first 10, 12 years of Albert Pujols' career, he might be one of the greatest natural hitters of all, like truly Ted Williams-like in his ability, just unbelievable pure hitter.
And so to try to put now Carl Yastrzemski, is got a long time ago since he's played, and so that his statistical contributions don't look as well because he played in a time when offense was down.
But then you can also and this is why WAR can be a little bit of a misleading thing here, because if you go down to 11th on this list, it's Adrian Beltre. And I love Adrian Beltre as a player. Obvious first ballot Hall of Famer, phenomenal player. Would never, ever even come close to reaching my list as greatest living ball player. No,
he's sitting in the passenger seat with Mike Schmidt at third base.
Right. It's just interesting. But that's why we kind of talk about, because then if you only go a couple places.
So was Wade Boggs, by the way.
Right. And then guess who's 3 places down from Wade Boggs?
Yeah, Brett.
No, Mike Trout.
Oh, Mike Trout. right. I even went to fourth third base.
Right, you got a bunch of third basemen, and then there's Mike Trout, who is one of the few active guys currently on this list, which is just wild to think about.
And there was a time where you thought about Mike Trout, wow, if he keeps this up, he could be the greatest player of all time. Injuries have changed that story.
Really changed that. And I think the lack of overall career success. It's so hard for me to name a guy that doesn't go to the postseason as the greatest ball player of all time. Bonds at least had World Series runs. Mike Schmidt had World Series runs. Ricky had titles. Trout is the only guy, when you look at this list, that you can think of almost zero postseason success.
Well,
that's not even his fault.
Isn't his fault. It's
not his fault, but it's just true. When you look at every other guy on this list, they're all guys that at least had moments in the postseason. I think Trout's been to one postseason, and that was his rookie season.
And the common theme with these guys, and you go below Trout, you got Chipper Jones, Hall of Famer, you got Fergie Jenkins, and like we said about pitchers,
you see MVPs and Cy Youngs.
Right, Pedro, Ken Griffey Jr. Now there's a name because he's farther down on the all-time B-WAR list because of injuries.
Right. If only he hadn't gone to Cincinnati.
There was a time, man, where that guy was going to be the greatest living ball player, I think.
Right. I mean, if you look at his run through the 90s into the late 90s with the Mariners, he was the greatest living
and what makes him a candidate for greatest living ball player was the ebullience with which he played the game. Willie Mays had that same ebullience in terms of just absolute joy and competitiveness, and Griffey at his peak was that.
Ken Griffey Jr. probably got a ton of young children into baseball because he was, I remember when I was 5, he was everybody's favorite player when you were growing up. Everybody loved Ken Griffey Jr.
And yeah, one of the sad things you heard at that game in Rickwood is I think something like only 7% of Major League ball players are African American right now. Ken Griffey Jr. did a good job of keeping them, but we just don't have enough guys playing because they're playing other sports, as they said on the telecast.
And then one of the other things that they've talked about with that is that baseball has become a very expensive game to play now. Whereas once it was the game that anybody could play with a stick and a ball in the street, it is now one of the more expensive games for kids to be playing, which is becoming a limiting factor, especially with all of the extraneous stuff, all of the coaches and the training and the data stuff that everybody's packing into this. You've now got 15-year-old kids getting their pitching motion scientifically broken down with a video camera to try and work on their telemetry and whatever.
Hank Aaron passed away a couple of years ago. I think even when Hank Aaron, maybe it's sacrilegious for me to say this, but I would have still had Willie Mays as my all-time greatest living ball player when Aaron was still with us. And yet late in his, as he passed away, all of a sudden it was, wow, he was the greatest ball player ever. And so that displays to me the absurdity of really trying to pick the greatest living ball player in the first place.
If you want to go back to the absurdity, we had this whole discussion where, Ty Cobb was the greatest living ball player while Babe Ruth was playing.
Right.
Like how do you deal with that? Because Ruth was obviously, but then even when both of them retired, Cobb still was holding on to the title, even though Ruth was clearly
the more impactful player,
right,
I would say. Yes. Certainly was the more impactful player. And then DiMaggio, who was the paragon, right? And held that title for a long time, and he loved being referred to as the greatest living ball player.
He would get himself introduced as greatest living ball player.
That just tickled him, and he was like in his 70s and 80s, still being referred to. That's just got to be such a jolt for you. So right now, I don't know that anybody really has taken that
And
moniker.
it might be a couple of years before we can really narrow down and say, yeah, it belongs to this guy for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, and even then, it's subjective, right?
It's like trying to name who the greatest player of all time is. A lot of the time, it comes down to personal bias and who you personally like the best.
There are a lot of people that would listen to this podcast and go, well, take Barry Bonds off the list, right?
And there's a lot of people that would
Take
say
A-Rod off the list. So
both
don't
of
even
those
include
guys
those guys.
are my greatest living ball player.
Right. So those guys don't count. So of the guys we can count, who do we put in there?
And it's like that becomes a very fun thing when you can criteria, eliminate guys until you get to the person you wanted to pick. Because if I was a Philly fan, I could come up with, Bonds and Clemens and A-Rod or all of that. Well, Mike Schmidt never was connected to anything. He's the greatest living ball player.
But I think we could come up with a pretty good starting 9 of greatest living ball players. That would be a fun exercise to do.
Finding a shortstop might be hard.
Yeah, well,
A-Rod.
A-Rod would probably be the
What about a
shortstop.
second baseman?
Do we even have one there that's
No.
in this group? Rod Carew.
Oh.
Rod Carew, I would put him there as a...
Yeah, and then it gets easy with your outfielders. And catcher, you got...
Well, you don't have... Johnny Bench isn't on the list in top war. Johnny Bench is my catcher.
Right.
So, we kind of have our team. If you put in Bonds and you put... I'm overlooking guys like Chipper Jones.
Yeah, Cal
who play
Ripken,
third base most of the time.
Third base has a ton of competition.
A lot of different, but if you put Ricky and Barry Bonds and you put Yastrzemski in the outfield,
It's a pretty good outfield.
That's a pretty good outfield. So and at first base, who do we have? Is anybody at first base in this group? I don't know.
we even left off Ken Griffey.
Right. My mistake. I would probably put Griffey over Yastrzemski. Please don't kill me, everybody, for saying that. There is no de facto first baseman on the list of top 25 all time.
We can stick. They're all talented.
Well, Pujols.
Yeah, Pujols would be him.
Pujols with that. So there you go. You got Pujols, Carew, A-Rod, pick your Mike Schmidt, I guess, at
Mike
third
Schmidt,
base. Johnny Bench.
Yeah, Bond.
Griffey, Bonds, and
You could put Trout
Henderson.
and Henderson.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good team.
Yeah, so they would do pretty well. So that's a much more fun subject to discuss. But I think when you talk about it in the context of a lot of guys, because I don't really want to pick one guy and say, this is the...
It'll be
greatest
interesting
player
to see
living
if
there.
there's a consensus that kind of forms over the next few
I
years.
don't see that happening, but yeah, I think you're right. I think it'll be interesting to see if it happens.